generally speaking, a relatively uncovered or less studied book of the Bible compared to maybe other books of the Bible. But I'm thankful for this chance to share with you some of my thoughts on this. I thought I'll begin with a little bit on my background and my kind of where I'm coming from as a in looking at the discipline of lament. Um, so there are kind of two major factors in my way of looking at lament. One is I grew up in a single parent home in a kind of a rough neighborhood in Baltimore. And I say that almost jokingly because all neighborhoods in Baltimore are kind of rough. But my neighborhood that I grew up in was about a third poor white, a third poor black, and a third poor immigrant, mostly Korean immigrants, but other immigrant groups as well. And so I'm growing up in this context of great diversity. Actually, I look around and I see people that are different with a commonality, which was poverty. But what I realized in growing up in that neighborhood was that even though we had poverty in common, we didn't end up getting along with each other, which was kind of disturbing to me because we all were struggling together. We were all um, oh, sorry, I heard some ruckus in the background there. Um, we all were living in poverty. We all were living in actually government subsidized housing. We were in the projects, and yet we couldn't get along. In elementary school, what we saw was most of us got along with each other fairly well. But then when you got to junior high school, you started seeing the racial divisions at the lunch tables. And there were kids, black kids at one table, white kids at one table, the immigrant kids at another table. And then actually by high school, we had full blown gangs in our neighborhood. Um, and it was one of the questions that really disturbed me even as a young person. Why is it that there is such racial animus um, and conflict between these groups? Um, and I actually thought maybe the church would do better at this. But when I went to church, I found out actually there was more segregation in the church
That's right.
than in my community. Even I mean, we weren't killing each other, but in terms of hurting each other, but in and which was happening in my neighborhood. But there was a Korean church, and there was a black church, and there was a white church, and I didn't meet other Christians. And over the years, the last 45 years of my life, I've been trying to figure a lot of this stuff out, trying to figure out what should unite us. And growing up in my neighborhood, I thought poverty was the common thing that would unite us. It didn't. And growing up and studying over the last 45 years, looking at churches and saying, well, we have a faith and we have a text and we have a common belief and a common savior. And yet we still have such challenging spaces where we don't get along with each other. So that's been one side of my story of trying to figure out over the years, why is it that things like George Floyd happened? A few weeks ago, as you know, there was the shooting of Asian Americans, the targeting of 6 Asian American women, and even the struggle of trying to explain that to friends that this what happened in Atlanta, the mass shooting in Atlanta, was not a one-off event. It was a culmination of 12 to 15 months of an increase in spike in hate crimes against Asian American communities. So for many of us in the Asian American community, we didn't see that as, oh no, this happened. We saw this as, oh no, this is the fulfillment of all the violence that has already been going on over the course of the year. My good friend Russell Jung, Dr. Russell Jung, is a professor at San Francisco State, and he helped to find Stop AAPI Hate. And what he noted was that there were about 4,000 different incidents since COVID over the last 12 years of hate crimes of various sorts, all the way to murder, and as simple as coughing and sneezing and kind of verbal abuse, oftentimes of elders, which has been really troubling. And that's what we saw with the shooting in Atlanta, the shooting of elders. And that was very painful to watch. So these kinds of social realities, can the church do better? To find out that the shooter in Atlanta was actually someone who grew up in the church, baptized in the church, discipled in the church. Um, why can't we as a church do better when it comes to these kinds of issues? The second part of what's kind of shaping my time for today is that I spent 17 years as a local church pastor. And I was a pastor, and I kind of did pretty much everything in the church over those 17 years that I was a pastor. I was an interim pastor, associate pastor, worship leader, minister to the elderly, minister to teenagers, minister to college students, the church planner, a senior pastor. The one thing I've never done is actually like children's ministry, like K through 5. Uh, one, because I just would be terrible at. I love kids. I just have no way of communicating effectively to K through 5. So God bless of you, any of you who have that gifting, because it really is a gift. But I know I don't have it. But I've done pretty much everything else in the church that you can think of. I even lived at a church for a couple of years when I was in seminary. The church graciously invited me because I was a poor seminary student, couldn't afford housing. They said, "Well, why don't you come and live at the church?" So I've done literally everything except for children's ministry in the context of the church. So that was like the first 15, 17 years actually of my career was in active, on the ground, day to day ministry. But for the last 15 years, I've been a professor at North Park Seminary. So I've kind of split my time. Half my time has been in the academic world over the last 15 years, but then the other half of my time has been ministry on a day to day basis in the local church and in the community. So part of my desire as a professor is to bring those two worlds together. That I want to do good academic study and I want to do good intellectual, rigorous, intellectual scholastic work, but I want it to be meaningful for the church. And that was my intent with my work on lament. I wanted to do the good intellectual, academic, scholarly work that I believe, holds up to academic scrutiny. But at the end of the day, I really wanted it to speak to the church. So that's what I want to do today. I want to reflect on the ways that I've seen um, the inability of the church to deal with complex issues, and also how do we do this in a very real way in the context of the local church. And particularly, I know as a church from the liturgical tradition, what are some of the questions that you might be asking when it comes to something as significant as in the Bible as lament, but oftentimes, while it's significant in the Bible, it is oftentimes not seen in the context of the church. And that's the first illustration I wanted to open with about why lament. There was three different studies that I want to point to. The first study was done by Dr. Denise Hopkins at Wesley Seminary. She's a Methodist, teaches at a Methodist seminary, and she was looking at liturgical communities, Christian communities, Catholic, Anglican, Episcopalian, Lutheran, and I believe Methodist as well. So there are about 5 or 6 um, high church, if you want to call it that, but churches that were using the lectionary, using the Book of Common Prayer, using kind of liturgy as their primary mode of worship expression. And of course, we know that in the liturgy and in the lectionary, you kind of rotate through the scriptures over a certain period of time, which is you do the scripture readings, you preach on certain passages. But what Dr. Hopkins found is that she was studying these churches, is that most American liturgical churches, when they got to a lament psalm, a psalm of lament, or the book of Lamentations, or anything, or you were supposed to sing a song or a hymn of lament, many of the liturgical churches skipped it or dropped the lament psalms, dropped the lament hymns, and replaced them with happier psalms or happier hymns. So what Dr. Hopkins was examining was, look, you're supposed to do this. You're supposed to read through lament and lamentations, but you don't, because it makes you uncomfortable, or because it's not user friendly in so many ways. So that was the study done in the liturgical tradition. Another study was done with kind of those who follow the hymnal worship, like hymnic worship. And this was actually with Baptist and Presbyterians and Baptist and Presbyterian hymnals. Now, if you look at the book of Psalms, the 150 chapters in Psalms, they represent pretty much the worship life of Israel. These are the Psalms that were sung, read, taught in the typical worship gathering in the temple and in the tabernacle of Israel. And of the 150 Psalms in our Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, 60% of those Psalms are Psalms of celebration. God is good, awesome is our God, God has blessed us, etc. But 40% of the Psalms are what we call Psalms of lament, which is my life isn't all that great. There are challenges. The enemy's against us, and we're about to get defeated by the opposing powers. Those are lament Psalms talking about pain and suffering. So what you see is not a 50-50 split, but 60-40. So there's a fairly good balance between songs of celebration and songs of lament. But what the study found is that in your typical Baptist and Presbyterian hymnals, you were looking at about 80 to 85% were songs of celebration, and about 15-20% were hymns of lament. So what's in the hymnal is disproportionate. It's not representative, similar to the Bible. It skews towards celebration. Now, by the way, that study was done just looking at the songs in the hymnals. It wasn't like what's actually sung, because that might even be lower. Like the number of lament psalms might be 20% in the hymnal, but it might be even lower the number of songs you actually sing that are lament songs. So I did a study on contemporary worship. And contemporary worship actually has a fairly good record keeping system. They license local churches to be able to project contemporary worship on screens. And they're given a license number, and then you call in every month or so with a list of songs that you sang, mainly because they have to keep a good record, because that's how they distribute royalties. So if one song is sung by every church, more royalties go to that person. That makes sense. That's only fair. So they actually have to keep pretty meticulous records about this. So they actually know pretty accurately what are the most popular contemporary worship songs that are sung, because they have a good record of them. They publish it every year. So I went through and I looked at every single word and song and lyric of every single of the top 100 most popular songs. And actually, that's not true. I made my TA, because that's what TAs are for. I made my teaching assistant go through every single lyric of every single song, read all the lyrics, and he reported back to me, and then I double checked his work. Again, that's how TAs work. But he went through and he said, I think there might be five lament songs out of the top 100 most popular contemporary worship songs. So I checked his work and I said, okay, I think there might be 10. And the reason there's 10 is I was being much more generous about what I was defining as lament. The song would start out, I cry out. And I said, yeah, I'm going to count that, even though the rest of the song is, I cry out for joy, or I cry out in celebration. I still had to count it because the number of lament songs was so pathetically low that it was like, this is terrible. There's only five out of top 100 worship songs or lament. So about 5 to 10 of the top most popular songs are lament, and the other 90-95 are songs of celebration, victory, triumph. Now, the question is, when you avoid lament, when lament is not a part of the normal cycle of worship, the liturgy of worship, um, what is the negative consequence of that? And Walter Brueggemann, whose work I was very much citing in my own work on lament, as well as Kathleen O'Connor. These were two of my best sources on this. Adele Berlin as well. There were some really wonderful reflections on lament. But Walter Brueggemann notes that in the absence of lament, many Christians, especially in the West, because that's where it's most noticeable, lose the sense of justice, because we don't understand the reality of suffering that is in the world. Because that's what lament does. I define lament as the appropriate liturgical, spiritual, ecclesial response to the reality of pain, suffering, and crisis in the world. So there's two key parts to that that I want to unpack in just a little bit. The first part is actually the second part, appropriate response. But the second part is recognizing that there is pain and suffering in the world. And if we don't lament, we don't have the opportunity to talk about the reality of pain and suffering in the world. And so, what Brueggemann argues, and I would agree, that if you don't lament, you don't acknowledge the pain and suffering in the world. You just kind of jump to, yes, Lord, everything is wonderful, everything is awesome, everything is cool, and don't stay in that place where, God, we are broken. God, the world is broken. God, things around us are not the way they should be. And so, when you're not confronted with injustice and the reality of injustice and brokenness, chances are you don't care as much about justice, because the injustice in the world is not facing you. So you can turn away and just say, hey, look, everything is awesome. Everything is cool. Why should we pursue justice when everything around us seems so good? And that's where lament as a spiritual practice interrupts what I've described as exceptionalism and triumphalism of American Christianity. We believe that we're a special people that shouldn't have to suffer. We believe we are a special people that shouldn't have challenges and difficulties. We believe we're an exceptional people that should be kind of clothed in greatness, clothed in triumph and victory. And when that doesn't always work out, there's a nervousness, there's an anxiety, there's a stress that is created. So some of my writing has been uh, two areas of history that I've looked at are the history of the Black church and the history of the Native American community. My most recent book, you can see kind of the banner over my shoulder, was co-authored with co-author Mark Charles, who is a Native American activist and pastor, a very dear friend, Navajo, and together we kind of told the story of suffering for the Native community. My doctoral dissertation was on the Black church and the history of suffering in the Black church, particularly in recent years in the larger evangelical world, the African Americans that have kind of gone through a lot of challenges in these places. Um, so those realities need to be dealt with. Those social realities, those uh, painful places, we can't ignore them. We have to deal with them. And lament is the way we can oftentimes introduce that. But I think many of our dominant culture churches' hesitation with lament, and maybe as a part of that, our hesitation to engage the more problematic aspects of American history, for example. We don't want to hear about slavery. We don't want to hear about the genocide of natives. In fact, we're going to recouch that to say slavery was okay as long as Black people became Christians. Uh, Genocide of natives was okay as because we brought Western civilization and Christianity to them. So there isn't the sustained engagement with a painful story, which should lead to lament. So again, as Burgelman says, the absence of lament oftentimes is the absence of justice or the desire to pursue justice because we're so focused on success, triumph. Look how good we are. Look how great we are. Look at a great nation we've built. We don't oftentimes stop to reflect on the pain and suffering that is actually in our world. Again, particularly for oftentimes Black, Brown, and Red communities in particular. Um, so that's the backdrop of why lament is an important discipline and a spiritual practice that very much needs to be, I think, reintroduced into the church. As I said, it's absent in almost every worship tradition you can think of. It's glaringly absent. But the necessity of bringing lament back into the spiritual practice, particularly given our social, political, cultural realities right now in the United States. When we see what happens with George Floyd, our response should not be excuse and justification. When we see what happened in the shooting in Atlanta, our first response should not be excuse and justification, which is, if you may recall, that was the first thing that came out. Oh, he had a bad day. Oh, he had a sex addiction. That's why he went out and killed all these Asian people. Um, that should not be the first words out of our mouths. The first words out of my mouths is, we have sinned, O God. We lament and repent of our brokenness before you. But instead, we kind of jump away from lament to either problem solving very quickly or more likely denial of the reality of pain and suffering that is in the world. Um, I'll give just in the next maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and just kind of have some discussion around this. I want to give two examples from the book of Lamentations about, actually, let's go with three examples of how we apply the discipline of lament into our particular cultural context. So let me share the screen real quick. And the first concept that I want us to look at is the concept of um, the reality of suffering that is in the world. And that has to do with the historical context of the book of Lamentations. Lamentations is written right on the heels of the fall of Jerusalem, which pretty much meant the end of Israel as a nation, and the exile of the people to Babylon. And we see this in the very first three passages, how deserted lies the city, once so full of people. She was like a widow, once great among the nations. So it's alluding to the fact that Israel, particularly under King David and King Solomon, was a great nation, But after the fall of the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, and now the capital city of Jerusalem, there's nothing left. Once a great city full of people, and now she's deserted like a widow, has now become a slave. So there's great tragedy here. Weeping at night, tears on our cheeks. No one comforts her. Others have betrayed her. Her friends have become her enemies. This is a great tragedy that the once proud and great people of God, the nation of Israel, had fallen on these tremendously difficult times. And of course, the worst punishment that they could endure is exile. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. So, as you know, in the Old Testament, when God says, I'm going to punish my people, the most extreme and harsh punishment that he can offer is to send the people into exile. And in Lamentations, right before Lamentations written, of course, that's exactly what's happened. They've lost their homeland. The Babylonians have conquered them, and the Babylonians have taken them into exile. So it is the lowest moment in their history. And yet God says, you are not to run away and hide from this painful situation. You are to lament and trust in God's sovereignty. So the temptation for God's people, once this occurs, is to run away and hide, bury their head in the sand like an ostrich. Yeah, I don't see it, I don't hear it, it's not a problem. And again, that's what oftentimes do by ignoring lament. We bury our head in the sand. There's no race problem in America. There's no social injustice in America. This is the land of the free and home of the brave. There's nothing bad about this. And so we run away and we bury our heads in the sand and we refuse to engage the problems of the world around us. Now, by the way, that is actually what happened in the early part of the 20th century. And in the early part of the 20th century, when the world was kind of falling apart in the US, at least in the self perception of American Christians, some of you know the history, the Scopes trial, the pandemic, Spanish flu, as well as what we saw with the stock market crash. There was a lot that was going on in the world, but there was also these kind of culture wars that was occurring in the 1920s. And as a result of that, many Christians decided to run away and hide. So we don't want to deal with the evil that is in the world. We're going to run away and hide. And I found this interesting that this was particularly noticeable in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it coincides and is actually correlated to not only Christians fleeing society, but white Americans fleeing urban centers to move to the suburbs. Historically, it's called the white flight. And it is usually due to non-Western Europeans like Italian Catholics, Polish Jews, Greek Orthodox moving into urban centers, and so Swedish Lutherans, German Lutherans, Scottish Presbyterians left urban neighborhoods and started moving into the suburbs. The other factor, of course, is the Great Migration that occurred after the Civil War all the way through to World War II, which was the migration of African Americans from the South after Emancipation Proclamation, seeking better jobs and opportunities and more freedom, of course, coming into northern centers like Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Minneapolis. But these northern cities, Midwest and East Coast northern cities, had a huge influx of African Americans. Many white Christians saw this as a new Babylon. This is not good. So they fled, left urban centers, and moved to suburban neighborhoods. Again, very well documented historical reality, the white flight of Christians. Um, so what I noticed is that at the height of white flight, when many white Christians were leaving urban centers and moving into the suburbs, that a lot of the architecture of churches built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s look like this, the chapel, you can see. Um, and I've traveled to enough churches to know that this is very common. And I would argue in the Midwest, you see this quite a bit, these kind of church buildings. I don't know, maybe your church building looks like this. I don't know. But I've seen a lot of church buildings, sanctuaries that look like this. And I remember in the late 70s being at a building dedication of a church building that looked like this and asking the question, why does this church building look like this? Now, I was in, very much like you all are, in a cold weather state. It was January and they were dedicating this building. And the heating vents, as you know, run along the floor. Why? Because heat rises. So you have this building that's being dedicated in January. They have the heat on, but where does all the warm air go? Right up into the rafters. So you literally have the frozen chosen in the pews and all the warm air up in the rafters. And I'm thinking, I was like 9 years old when this building he was naked. This is the stupidest building I've ever been in. 9-year-old thinking this is a really, really bad idea. Whose idea was it to build a church building like this? And our pastor gets up and he says, it was my idea to make the church building and sanctuary to look like this. And he said, I want you to picture the entire building turned upside down. And what do you see? And we picture this and we say, oh, he said, well, you're looking at the bottom of a ship. You're looking at the bottom of a boat. And the question was, well, if you look at the bottom of a boat, what what does that mean? What's the symbolism of a church being a boat? And the answer is, when you look at the bottom of a boat, you are looking at Noah's Ark. The church is Noah's Ark. And think about what that means for the church to say to the world, we're Noah's Ark. We don't really care if you get destroyed by the world. We're safe here. We don't really care if God's judgment comes and destroys the world, as long as I'm safe in Noah's Ark. And this is the mentality that was facing the people of God in the book of Lamentations. Run away and hide. The world has beat you, it's defeated you. So the best thing you can do is just kind of huddle amongst yourselves, be comfortable with each other, but don't worry about what's going on in the world out there. What lament does is it introduces us and disrupts that narrative to say, think about the pain and suffering that is in the world and don't just huddle amongst yourselves in Noah's Ark. Lament calls us to consider historical, cultural, contextual reality. So that's one of the first steps in lament. How do we begin to consider the actual social reality by thinking through what is going on in the world around us? So that's the first thing. Lament calls us to consider and not ignore the pain that is in the world. The second thing about lament is actually something interesting about authorship. Who wrote the book of Lamentations? There is some scholarly discussion on this, and there are two opposing perspectives. The first is, as I mentioned earlier, when the exile occurs, who's left behind in Jerusalem? Because we know from the book of Lamentations that whoever wrote was in Jerusalem at the time. But what we know, things we know about exile was actually not every single resident of Jerusalem was taken away. They didn't need to do that. Well, who did they take? Well, they took the learned, the educated, the literate, the prophets, the priests, and the kings. And of course, the story of Daniel and his friends. Why did Daniel and his friends get taken? Because they're young men who could read or write, who were educated, and who could potentially rebuild the city of Jerusalem. So they didn't take everybody. They just took the learned, they took the educated, they took the leaders, mostly men, out of the capital city. And the ones that were left were the widows, the orphans, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and the sick. Oh, they're not going to be able to rebuild anything. So the Babylonians left them behind. But if that's the case, who could have written this document? Because it's clearly a document that is written by someone with writing skills. This is not like an illiterate person writing it. Clearly, a literate person wrote this. And the only thing we know for sure in terms of literacy is that there was definitely one person who was literate who was left behind, and that was Jeremiah. And there's a whole story behind that. Jeremiah, in his book, repeatedly says, give in to the Babylonians. Their God's righteous judgment. Babylonians knew, so they said, oh, he must be on our side. We'll let him stay. So he wasn't taken into exile, possibly, and maybe even probably the only literate person left in Jerusalem. So in that sense, one side says, well, Jeremiah must have written it. He's the only literate person left, so these must be his words. Here's the problem for other scholars, though. You read the book of Lamentations, and you compare that to Jeremiah, which we're pretty sure he wrote, and it is like two different styles of writing, completely different, completely different styles, poetry versus prose. I mean, just like my comparison has been, if you read Shakespeare and then read Tupac, uh, maybe this is the wrong audience for Tupac, uh, Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan. Let's use Bob Dylan. So if you read Shakespeare and read Bob Dylan, you, you would say they are both great writers, right? I mean, Dylan actually has a Pulitzer, I believe. They're both great writers. They're probably not the same person because the writing styles are so markedly different. Well, that's the comparison of Jeremiah and Lamentations. Um, Again, Jeremiah might be the only literate person left, but this is not his style of writing. It can't be him. So what's the answer? Well, this is where lament is so wonderful. Jeremiah is not speaking his own words or writing down his own words. He's there. I believe he's there. Historically, we know he was there. So he goes to the town center, which would have been the city gate, and all the people come out after the fall. And the only ones left, again, widows, orphans, crippled, the lame, the blind, and the sick. And they start sharing their stories. They start talking about this is how I've suffered. And this is how I felt the pain of the exile and the pain of conquest. And Jeremiah writes these words down. So you see in the book of Lamentations what's called a prophetic interlocutor, narrator, prophetic narrator, who will give commentary in like certain spaces, but ultimately the voices you hear are the voices of the women, children, crippled, the lame, blind, the sick, the most marginalized in that society. Real, true, authentic lament comes from the marginalized communities, not from the places of power. So Jeremiah had the power. He's a prophet. He's a learned one. He has this authority that comes with being the learned prophet. And again, the only leader left in the city at this point. And yet he shuts his mouth and wants other voices to speak. I actually note that Lamentations is probably the most feminine book of the Bible, more so than even Ruth or Esther, because Jeremiah, the male prophet, shuts his mouth and gets out of the way so that the voices of the women who have suffered the most in this context, their voices rise up. So I would say true lament oftentimes requires not the voice of the privileged, but the voice of the suffering. Lament means that it's not those of us who have the education who speak, or those of us who have the authority who speak, but it's that moment where we say, actually, we really, really need to hear from George Floyd and his family. We really need to hear from the silenced voices of the Korean elderly women who were shot and their families. Those are the voices we want to center. So, lament, part of the practice of lament is the privilege shutting their mouths and allowing those who have suffered to have their voices rise up front and center. The third point I want to make from the book of Lamentations around lament has to do with structure. And let me put this PowerPoint up real quick. The structure of Lamentations is really fascinating in that it follows something called the acrostic formula. I think you can see that. The acrostic formula um, is a basic poetic device. And that's, by the way, how we know a literate person wrote down the Book of Lamentations, because it uses something like the acrostic formula. So what you see, there's 5 books in Lamentations. Chapter 1 and chapter 2 uses a simple acrostic, meaning every line or every verse begins with, I wrote down the word A here, but it's actually the Hebrew letter of the alphabet, Aleph. So it just kind of goes through the Hebrew alphabet in order, A, B, C, or Aleph, Beta, I'm sorry, Aleph, Beit, Gimel. So it kind of goes through the Hebrew alphabet in order to show structure. There's an intensification in chapter 3 where each line in chapter 1 and chapter 2, A starts and then there's 2 other lines. But in Lamentations 3, all 3 lines begin with the letter A, or the Hebrew letter Aleph. Lamentations 4, it goes back to a simple acrostic. And in Lamentations 5, it just says 23 verses. And the letters are all mixed up, but it's the number of letters. So what we're seeing in the acrostic formula one of the lessons for us is, I think, the incredible power of worship that provides a space for grief to be expressed. And this is one of the theories around the acrostic formula. Why use a formula like this? Because there are times when grief is unable to be expressed well, that it's limiting on 2 levels. One, you have so much grief and pain that it all comes out at once and it's overwhelming for the talker as well as the listener. And we know this. We've seen this where there's so much grief pent up and it just all comes flooding out. And for the listener and for the speaker, it's sometimes hard to connect. So the acrostic formula gives boundaries that says, let's walk through this grief together. The other part is the ones who've suppressed grief for so long, they don't know how to express it. It's not coming out at once. It's stifled. It's stunted. And so giving the acrostic formula allows the expression of that grief. So this is where, to me, liturgy is just one of these spaces where the formulas or the boundaries or the rhythms of a church worship life actually creates space for grief to be expressed, for lament to be expressed. Now, that's if you take advantage of that space. Like I said, oftentimes lament gets replaced. But if you create the space for lament and it becomes a practice, not like, we do it every once in a while, but a regular practice, um, what it does is it creates that space for grief to be expressed where grief could not be expressed before. Um, the way I would close on this is I love movies. My son and I, one of our favorite pastimes is to go watch good movies. And we love good acting in good movies. And if you know anything about movies, some actors use this method called character acting or method acting. I'm sorry, method acting. And Robert De Niro, Daniel Day Lewis, some of the best use method acting. The idea behind method acting is that they get so into the character and they live and embody and practice that character so much that if they were to improvise a line, it would be true to that character because they're so into that character. They've lived it, they practiced it. So as a joke, like if you see Robert De Niro at a coffee shop in L.A. and he's working on a movie, don't talk to him because if he's working on like a gangster movie, he might talk to you like a gangster and treat you, in that way because he's so into that character. It comes out of who you are reflexively, instinctively, improvisationally, because you're so embodied and practiced in that character. Um, Part of our problem is that we don't practice lament. We don't embody lament. And so when it comes time to lament the death of George Floyd, when it comes time to lament the death of Asian American women in Atlanta, when it comes time to lament the insurrection that occurred in January, when it comes time to lament children at the border who are separated from their parents, who are being incarcerated, when it comes time to lament slavery, the genocide of natives, Japanese internment, there's a lot of things we should lament. it we haven't embodied that practice enough for it to become a positive instinctive reflex. And so we become that character because we practice it, because we live it. And so lament becomes, if we want to be practitioners of justice, we practice lament because it emboldens us and it embeds in us these practices out of which we operate that makes us instinctively, intuitively, improvisationally operate out of justice because that is the character that we've embedded. So I talked much faster and longer than I should have, but I would love to hear some feedback or questions from the group.
Thank you, Dr. Rod. We had a confirmation student that wrote down in the chat, and Nolan, I don't know if you want to unmute and just go ahead and ask your question. I
Yeah,
think
let's hear the
this is a
question.
good one.
My question is lament like reflection, like reflecting off of something?
That's a great question. And the answer actually is lament is multifaceted. And that's what's beautiful about lament. Um, one of the ways that you can lament is to look at the broken world and rehearse or reflect that back, right? Now, it doesn't mean God doesn't know that the world is busted or messed up. God knows that the world is busted and messed up. But us saying that is reflecting the character of God. When we see brokenness in the world and God sees it, when we lament to God, God, do you see that dead body? Do you see George Floyd's dead body? Do you see the history of brokenness? Can you hear us, oh God? We're tapping into who He is. There's a great quote from the founder of World Vision, a Christian relief organization, and the founder of World Vision had this quote: "Let my heart break by the things that break the heart of God." And what you're saying is, in as worship and lament as a reflection, is you see the brokenness, you reflect that back to God and to each other, and your heart is broken by the things that break the heart of God. Because God's heart is broken by racism. God's heart is broken by sexism. God's heart is broken by mass shootings. God's heart is, we forget that God's heart can be broken by these things that are broken in the world. And our reflection of that, our retelling of that to God is actually reflecting the character of God and also tapping into what God expects us as His people. Great question. Thanks, Nolan.
Thank you.
Other questions or reflections or things that?
Yeah, Doctor, this is Fred Jensen. I think one of the neat things about Shepherd of Hills, our church, is that we've had leadership. Pastor Scott has given us the structure and permission to lament, given all that's gone on this last year with the pandemic and racial issues, shootings, children at the border, you name it. And I think that's was really important and part of our worship life, and we really appreciate that. One thing, just a question, what do you think about the expressions of lament, maybe in the citizens coming out in the protests that happened? Would you call that a form of lament, given all that's happened with the dichotomy and stuff going on in our society?
Yeah, there's a lot of different protests. So I'm going to generalize. You talk about the BLM protests of a year ago and over the summer. You can talk about the protests that occurred over the election. This has been a year of protest, right? And I do look at protests as an expression of lament. I really do, because I think it's trying to verbalize or physically, even physically, corporately express the reality of pain, right? So that, I think, now the question is it appropriate? That's a different story. So protest versus violence, protest versus raiding the Capitol, protest versus looting shops. There's a lot of differentiation there, but I would say that the act of protest itself is an expression of lament. Now, the question again is not only the appropriate response, but what is the protest of? I will say this, and this is something that I've been still grappling with, and I still haven't quite figured this out. And Mark and I write about this in our book. I think everybody in America in some form or another is traumatized right now. It's not just Black folk. It's not just Latinos or Asian Americans. Everybody is traumatized. And I'm going to say that the trauma is about the demonic negative effects of white supremacy, which has traumatized Black folks because of the history of slavery, traumatized Native Americans because of the genocide, and traumatized Asian Americans, as we've seen more recently, Latinos, but it has also traumatized white Americans. So the reason why I say the demonic power of white supremacy is the white supremacy assumes that white should be center or primary or superior positionally to other people groups. Now, I'm not saying that everybody believes that, but I'm saying that that's in our narratives, that's in our history. It was the imagination that allowed for the capturing of Black slaves. It was the imagination that saw America as a blank slate that you can just kind of go and conquer, and ended up in the genocide of natives. So this imagination or worldview of white supremacy has been harmful. And it's not, again, individuals that are white supremacists like neo-Nazis or skinheads. We're talking about this larger narrative of white supremacy. But what I would argue is that, yes, it has clearly harmed African Americans, clearly harmed Native Americans, but it hasn't really good for white people either. And that trauma of white supremacy has also impacted white people in some ways as well. So what I see is the narrative of white supremacy says white should be at the top of society, white should be the dominant group, the culture of whiteness should be, European culture mostly, should be the most superior to all these others. The fact is, 99% of white America can't live up to that, right? Now you get, the Jeff Bezos and, you get these billionaires who are living up to that expectation of, white superiority means they're going to have the best, they're going to make the most money, they're going to be, have these positions of prominence. But let's be honest, 99% of all of America, much less white or Black or brown America, just can't live up to that. And so you've set these insanely impossible standards of white supremacy. And those who can't live up to that are traumatized by that to such an extent that they're going to grab at it to get it back. So that's their protest. So when I saw the march on the insurrection in the Capitol, I saw some really deeply traumatized people who have been told all their lives you're a superior race, who have been told all their lives you should be at the top of this society. And they weren't, and they couldn't be. And because there's very small space for the top of the society. And sometimes it's not about color, it's just about very limited people can be at the top of that society. And so these folks have been traumatized by white supremacy in a different way than Black Americans and Asian Americans, but they've been traumatized.
I think that's right. I think you're onto something there. I think there's a lot of fear
Yeah.
in those folks. And it's kind of interesting, your study of the white evangelical church, do they have a lot of lament in their churches? Probably not, right?
Well, that's
And
why
they kind of hydroplane across the deep stuff, and they're very fearful, kind of want to keep things the same. And so they might blame it on the other or whatever.
Right. Well, that's where the you're seeing like the evangelical forms of worship, whether that's the Baptist Presbyterian hymnals or the contemporary worship. That's where you see the absence of lament most noticeably. Now, I would hazard to guess, same as you, that if we were to go to your typical evangelical church that's kind of under this umbrella of white supremacy or white centeredness, they probably haven't done much teaching on lament either, or good teaching on lament. And so this is a huge liturgical spiritual gap. And that's why I'm kind of saying, when a mass shooting occurred, our first response should not be X, Y, and Z. It should be a corporate lament. Because if we get into the practice of that, we're going to see the injustice that is in the world. I mean, there is a trauma that people have experienced. And one of the best ways to resolve or deal with trauma is lament. I mean, think about a funeral service. Um, Families that can lament at a funeral service versus being in denial. So I'm not a therapist, but I lost my mom this past year, and one of the most significant things was being able to be together with my family. Sorry, uh, with my sisters at my mom's bedside as she passed away, and lament together, but also be in this joyful celebration of her life and lament that she's not going to be with us anymore. That was so healing, and the loss of my mom felt a little less because the community, my family, my sisters and I especially, were around her, and her grandchildren were around her. That kind of corporate lament was very healing. And I feel for those who are so caught up in their exceptionalism that they can't experience the healing power of lament.
I think I think that's exactly right. I felt a sense of relief and to breathe again a little bit. I think our country was waiting to lament and grieve a little bit. I remember at the new administration at the reflection pool that was lit up for those who have passed away due to COVID. And I think that gave us a sense, I think we needed that.
And there was so much pent up emotion and pain because of COVID. Like we couldn't, I mean, that was one of the most, I think, horrific things that, I lost two students very early on because of COVID-19. There were two of my students in prison. I teach a class in Stateville Correctional Center. And many of you know that the prison population was one of the earliest hit, especially in Chicago, and one of the hardest hit. So two of my students died in March. So very early, in March of last year. So very early on. And I remember, wanting to visit, and I'm clergy, so I was trying to get under the clergy exception to try to, and they wouldn't. Family wasn't allowed to visit. They were in isolation. We're trying to sneak an iPad in there so the students could actually say goodbye to their classmates in prison, but also to their family and to the community. And it was almost impossible to do that. We were able to get in to see the family, but not in person. Um, that was a huge, huge, painful space where many of us didn't have the opportunity to grieve. Um, and let's be blunt, some of that was this exceptionalism idea, right? So why can't we admit that people are dying? Well, America's an exceptional country. We don't do that. Why can't we admit that we're not handling this well? Well, America's the greatest country in the world. We don't grieve. We don't lament. We don't talk about suffering. That's not our reality. I remember actually very early on, there was a question to, I think, Vice President Pence about, why aren't we doing what this country is doing? And they were talking about masking, on a larger scale, or, some restrictions. And then there was another country that had kind of had some preliminary vaccine that seemed to be, and there were all these questions about, well, why don't we follow, what some other countries are doing that are doing these successes? And the answer was, we don't do that. We lead, we don't follow. we're going to figure this out on our own. We're always going to be, and that kind of lack of humility and lack of lament, uh, that's what was so stifling over this past year. And I think you're right. There was a cathartic moment when we acknowledged this has killed a lot of people, because that was never acknowledged by our leaders during the time of COVID itself. And it really was, and it took a new administration to say, we've been through this and we need to lament together. I was really hoping the churches, while for a number of reasons, the government and our politicians couldn't lament, this would have been the perfect time for the churches to let's do what the government cannot do, which is to do the spiritual practice of lament. Now, many did. Sounds like your church did, but many of our religious leaders did not, and that's really heartbreaking for me. That what should have been the place where the church could stand up and bear witness. This is what God's people do. This is how we bring healing to those that are hurting. Many instead opted for this triumphalistic narrative instead, and you know um, and we're still kind of reeling from that pain that we've really suppressed and haven't had a chance to lament. I think that's changing. A lot of different reasons, not just the change in the presidential office, but more and more people are realizing the need for lament, and that lament is not a sign of weakness. It actually is an important Christian practice.
Other questions or reflections? I've got one myself, but don't
Yeah.
want to. I'm sort of curious. In a liturgical tradition like us as Lutherans, confession is a regular part of our liturgical worship service, and that's sort of like lament adjacent in kind of it's not exactly the same, but it's kind of in the ballpark. And I'm wondering if there ever have been, other than the Psalms and those kinds of things, practices that have been historically oriented towards lament. And the one that comes to mind, and maybe this is what you were referring to, Fred, is that we've spent some time thinking about the Jesuit Examen, which, depending on how you look at it, we've boiled it down to a gratitude, where we'll start a meeting with a devotion where we'll offer a gratitude, or we'll offer a lament. And then as good Lutherans, we have liturgical responses, either thanks be to God or Lord have mercy. But other than that, are there other sort of liturgical, spiritual, historical practices where lament has played a central role?
Yeah, I think the problem with Westminster civilization is that the advent of Christendom, where Christians became like the center of power in society, and you can look clearly at Constantine as kind of one of those spaces in the third, and starting from the third century, going into the fourth century, you start beginning seeing Christianity as the religion of empire and the advent of Christendom, and that gets sustained for quite some time. So that's why some of these early desert fathers are more lament geared, right? So you see that a little bit more in these communities, because once there's the advent of Christendom, you're going to see a shying away from lament, because you're not lamenting the reality of pain in the world, because if you're in charge, you don't want to acknowledge the reality of pain in the world. So that's part of the problematic spaces that we've created, where communities that are on the other side of Christendom, meaning those in power, oftentimes have the most difficulty engaging lament. So I would say look for spaces and in the traditions where they weren't in places of power and authority. And so lament, I mean, like I mentioned that I've done some work in the Black church. Um, the Black church liturgy and the worship that comes out of the Black church is some of the most rich laments, yet expressed in some incredible celebration. I'm not a musician, but what I do know is the more prevalent use of the minor key. Kind of the fact that gospel music, births the blues is not an accident. Because there's a very strong musical, spiritual link between gospel music and the blues are some of the most incredible laments. I think some hip hop in this generation now is some of the best laments. I think there was actually an article that I read comparing Kendrick Lamar, who's a hip hop artist, saying some of the stuff that he's doing is just some of the best laments that are out there. So that's where I think um, communities that tend to be on the other side of Christendom, meaning have benefited from state power and privilege, uh, lament is oftentimes noticeably conspicuously absent. But communities, and it's not necessarily worship, but the life of the Black church, the story of the Native communities. A lot of, in fact, Korean theology, you'll see a lot of lament in Korean theology, mainly because Korea as a nation was repeatedly conquered. It's, if you know the geography, it's a small peninsula conquered by the Chinese and then the Japanese and the Chinese again and then the Japanese and then the Russians and then the US and then the Chinese. I mean, it's been for that little strip of land, there has been multiple conquests. And so out of that history comes a profound lament ethos, lament culture. And so if you look at some of the, I wouldn't quite say liturgy, and same thing with the Black church, but if you look at the worship patterns and the certainly the hymnody out of these communities, you'll see a lot more lament. So non-Western dominant culture is going to have expressions of lament because of their setting in life. It's going to be more conducive to lament. You know, think about the song Amazing Grace and how it was adopted out of the lament of the slaves in the hull of the ship that John Newton overheard and he wrote it down. It's a wonderful praise song, but it's also in its kind of haunting, lilting way, very much a lament. And so that's where we draw from the rich heritage of other groups and other communities where their lament, and it might not be liturgy per se, as in readings and the like, but their approach to worship reflects more lament because their setting is one of suffering. And so it's more likely the lament will come out of those settings.
Todd, I wasn't, thank you, thank you. I heard, thank you. I wasn't sure if that was Todd or Cindy writing in the chat there, if you wanted to ask your question. And
Oh yeah, that was Todd. I just asked anyone really to answer what is the most well-known song of lament in the church, in your opinion, and then Soong,
Joan.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Said Amazing Grace. So
Yeah.
that's a good. I think it does seem like kind of a mix. It's kind of a lament and
yeah.
But yeah, I was just.
Yeah, a lot of good.
Joan, looks like Joan had an idea of what maybe.
Well, yes, Holy Week songs we sing on Monday, Thursday, and Friday. Bring me to tears every year, and I think we need to do more of that. In that week, we're remembering the death of Jesus and all he sacrificed for us. But I and Scott, you were asking about, the confession that we do as Lutherans. We accept the fact that we've been sinful and we ask for forgiveness and all that. If it can somehow be expanded as to, what's happened in society, what's happened around us, it's been very sinful and is bothering us in many ways. I wish that somehow could be addressed. I think it would really, really hit people. We do need to lament. We really, really do.
Yeah, thanks, Joan. I think that's true. I wondered too, Dr. Ra, if you've had any sort of empirical evidence about the connection, when I hear you talk about this, between lament and people's capacity for empathy. Is there a connection there? Is that?
I would be interested in this myself in terms of there's a lot of stuff that's kind of out of my area of expertise. And one of them is some of this trauma stuff is kind of, in the early stages. And Mark and I have encouraged, we know a couple of people who are doing doctoral level work in trauma that they need to really take up this a little bit more. And this would be an area that I would like to consider as well, kind of therapists, psychiatrists who understand this well. Um, how does lament lead to healing, in a way that kind of glossing over it is not going to do, right? So I don't have the kind of study on this. What I do know is that in kind of both personal experience and in ministry and thinking theologically and biblically, that this is something that we've seen in the scriptures to be able to lament. We see this with David at the death of his son, lamenting. Actually, on multiple occasions where his sons die, he's lamenting, and he kind of is able to walk through that, and he writes several laments in the midst of that. So, is there something powerful about lament leading to some of this healing? Um, and the question is, did that lead to, and certainly in the Psalms, it seems like a greater sense of empathy David seems to have, because when we read the Psalms, we're seeing, oh, there's a compassion and empathy there that we can connect to. So, if you look at it kind of in the biblical framework, was David able to exhibit greater empathy because he was able to live through the lament? Um, so I think embracing lament, I think you're right. Again, I don't think there's any empirical data per se, but anecdotally, I would say those who embrace lament are able to show greater empathy. I mean, um, I think our current president is kind of an example of that, mainly because he's had tragedy in his life, and as a Catholic, I think he has expressed lament through liturgy, in both the death of his wife, and two of his children. Um, that's a pretty incredible place of demanding lament, right? I mean, you have to do it in order for there to be some kind of healing. And that's why, at least and by many accounts, there's a real empathy there that seems to have been lacking in the predecessor, where uh, I mean, again, this could be all media hype, but that he seems to exhibit significant more empathy, because he's kind of been through it himself. And I think there's some value to that. I'll give another example, again, more anecdotal. When the thing with Atlanta hit, um, and the whole thing around the death of older Korean women. There were 4 Korean women that were killed. I was very shook by that, again, because I lost my mom recently. My mom was in the service industry. So these women, they were not sex workers. You have a 74-year-old, 69-year-old, 63-year-old. These are not sex workers. These are people who picked up the towels. These are people, who cleaned up and mopped after you. And that's the kind of work that my mom did. She worked in a nursing home. She worked in an inner city carryout. So there was something really visceral that I felt when there was all this garbage talk about these are sex workers, and even some saying, oh, they deserve to be shot because they're sex. I mean, it was just extraordinarily painful for me to see that, and I was actually finding it difficult to lament because this was so painful to hear this feedback about you know censoring the violent perpetrator, the 21-year-old white boy, versus really honoring these Korean women, older women, senior citizens, frankly. And that wasn't happening. So I was really pained by that. But the people that really reached out and cared for me during this time with great empathy were Black and brown women. Um, so my first email was from an African American colleague of mine. She now teaches at Vanderbilt. She emailed me, "Are you okay? How are you doing? I can pray for you." She's a therapist, so she just like immediately kind of offered her help for this. There was a Latina woman an older woman. These were all kind of older women, Black and brown, who had these experiences that led to greater empathy. Latina woman who, like the day after Atlanta shooting, I find this email from her and says, "I just sent you $40 on DoorDash, and I want you to treat you and your family to a meal. I don't want you to, just to as a way of like." And then this happened on multiple occasions. An African American woman in my neighborhood cooked up a huge batch of chicken, brought it over, and said, "I know you're going through some stuff, so I cooked up this chicken." And I'm not going to read the letter, but I wrote her an email to thank her. And there were about 3 or 4 Black and brown women, Black and Latina women, who reached out to me to say, we know what you're going through. We've been through it ourselves in many ways. So we empathize with you. And a little gesture of that. So, I'm still kind of moved by that kind of empathy. And I think it comes from the very real stories that they experienced and the pain that they've experienced and the lament that they've had to engage. And so the empathy towards a community, not just me personally, but the community that has suffered. That was very healing. That was very healing. But also that it was coming from the Black and brown women. That was also very healing.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I do want to note that we are a little bit over time. And so I just, please join me in saying thank you to Dr. Ra. I really enjoyed your book. So I wanted to say that also personally, and go buy it, go read it. It's great. You'll enjoy it. I promise. It's very readable and very moving. So thank you so much. Dr. Ra, if you would stick around for just a second so we can chat just a bit before you go. Thank you all. Would you please offer a round of thanks to Dr. Ra for being with us?
Thank you. My pleasure. Very glad to be here.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Go in peace. Just love and serve the Lord.
Thank you.
God. See you all.